Sam Melville sat in the mess hall at Attica Correctional Facility in the summer of 1971, staring at a tray of food that looked like it had already been eaten once. The men around him, more than 2,000 packed into a prison built for half that number, picked at the same gray slop. Some had stopped complaining. Others were just getting started. Number 19 on this list was so foul that men who refused it went hungry until the next day. Number 8 turned a daily meal into a deliberate act of disrespect, and number 1 is the meal that never made it to the table. What the state of New York fed the men inside Attica was not just bad food. It was a message. Hit subscribe because what came out of that kitchen will change the way you look at every prison in America. Here are 25 forgotten meals actually served at Attica before the 1971 riot. Number 25, powdered eggs. Every morning at Attica started the same way. A scoop of reconstituted egg powder hit the tray in a rubbery yellow lump. The texture was closer to wet cardboard than anything that ever came from a shell. Inmates described it as flavorless, sometimes chalky, sometimes carrying a faint chemical aftertaste that lingered well into the afternoon. The eggs were mixed in enormous batches and sat in open warming trays long before any man reached the front of the line. By the time most of the population sat down, the eggs had cooled into a stiff, slightly gray mass that pulled away from the tray in one solid piece. There was no salt on the table, no pepper, no hot sauce, nothing to mask what the state of New York considered a complete breakfast. For men who would spend the next 16 hours locked inside a concrete cell, this was the first thing their bodies had to work with, and it barely qualified. Number 24, watered-down coffee. What Attica called coffee was hot brown water. Kitchen workers brewed it in massive industrial urns, stretching the grounds until the liquid barely held any color. Former inmates recalled that it tasted like someone had waved a coffee bean over a pot of warm tap water and walked away. There was no cream, no sugar unless you bought it from commissary, and most men could not afford commissary prices. On cold winter mornings in upstate New York, when the cell block walls held the chill like the inside of a meat locker, that thin, bitter cup was the only warmth a man would feel until lights out. It was not comfort. It was barely a beverage. But every man drank it, because the alternative was nothing at all. Number 23, bread fried in reused grease. When the kitchen had leftover cooking oil, and it always had leftover cooking oil, it went back into the fryer the next day, and the day after that, and the day after that. By the time a slice of bread hit that pan, the grease was dark, thick, and smelled like every meal that had come before it. The bread came out soggy on the inside and slick on the surface, coated in a film of old animal fat that left a taste in the mouth long after the tray was cleared. Nothing was wasted at Attica, least of all the cheapest commodity in the kitchen. That grease had seen fish, pork, potatoes, and whatever else the state sent upstate that week. It all ended up on the same slice of bread, and the men had no choice but to eat it or go without. Number 22, stale cornbread. Attica served cornbread that had been baked in enormous batches and stored until it dried out completely. By the time it reached the trays, it had the texture of compressed sand. It crumbled if you looked at it wrong, and chewing it pulled every drop of moisture from your mouth. There was no butter, no honey, no jam, nothing to soften the experience. Some batches arrived with a faint green tinge along the edges where mold had already started to set in, and the kitchen served those batches anyway. The men learned to break the cornbread apart and check the inside before eating, but even the clean pieces were so far past fresh that they tasted like cardboard. It was filler, pure and simple, something to take up space on the tray and create the illusion of a complete meal. The state was not feeding men, it was filling trays. Number 21, powdered milk. Fresh milk did not exist inside Attica. What the men received was reconstituted powder mixed with water. and whoever handled the mixing never got the ratio right. It was either impossibly thin and bluish or thick with undissolved clumps floating on the surface like sediment. The taste was chalky and faintly sour, nothing like the milk these men remembered from the outside. It arrived lukewarm at best and stayed that way. For men who had families, who could remember pouring cold milk for their own children at a kitchen table, drinking this stuff was a small daily reminder of everything they had lost. And unlike the coffee, you could not even pretend it was something else. It was powdered milk, and it tasted exactly like what it was, a cheap substitute for the real thing, handed to men who had no power to ask for better. Number 20. Mystery Meat Stew. Once or twice a week, a thick brown stew appeared on the menu with no clear explanation of what was actually in it. The meat was cut into pieces small enough that identifying the animal was impossible. Some inmates believed it was whatever scraps the kitchen had accumulated during the week, boiled together with potatoes and canned vegetables until everything surrendered into the same muddy brown. The gravy was more flour than drippings. The potatoes were mealy and half-dissolved, and the meat had a rubbery chewiness that suggested it had been cooked, cooled, stored, and reheated at least twice before landing on anyone's tray. Nobody asked what it was anymore. The kitchen never volunteered. You ate it, you moved on, and you tried not to think about what your body just processed. Number 19. Overcooked spaghetti. The kitchen at Attica cooked its pasta in massive vats, and by the time it was portioned out, the noodles had been sitting in water so long they had dissolved into a gray, gluey mass that stuck together in a single heavy lump. There was no al dente, there was no texture at all. The sauce, if you could call it that, was a thin, watery tomato liquid with no garlic, no herbs, no depth. It tasted like ketchup diluted with dishwater. The noodles absorbed it all and still managed to taste like nothing. Men who had grown up in Italian households in Buffalo and Rochester, men whose mothers and grandmothers had been making sauce from scratch their entire lives, sat in front of this and could not believe a kitchen had produced it on purpose. But the kitchen had not produced it on purpose. The kitchen had produced it on budget. A 50-pound bag of dried pasta cost almost nothing and fed hundreds. Quality was never part of the calculation. The spaghetti at Attica was not a meal someone had cooked. It was raw material that had been processed into the minimum shape required to fill a tray, and every man in that mess hall knew it. Number 18. Bologna on white bread. Lunch at Attica often meant a single bologna sandwich. 2 slices of dry white bread, 1 thin circle of processed meat in between, no mustard, no lettuce, no tomato, nothing else. The same sandwich appeared day after day with such mechanical regularity that inmates said they could go entire weeks without seeing a single variation at the midday meal. The bologna was room temperature by the time it reached anyone's hands. The bread was stiff. The entire thing could be eaten in 3 bites, and after those 3 bites, lunch was finished. For men doing hard physical labor in the prison workshops, hauling metal and standing on concrete for hours, this was supposed to carry them through 6 hours until dinner. It did not come close. Number 17. Canned vegetables well past their prime. The kitchen at Attica burned through enormous quantities of institutional canned goods, and not all of them were recent stock. Inmates reported cans arriving dented, rusted along the seams, or bulging slightly at the lids. The vegetables inside, usually green beans, peas, or corn, came out in a grayish heap with a metallic aftertaste that lingered no matter what else was on the tray. There was no way to know how long those cans had been sitting in a state warehouse before reaching the facility. New York bought in bulk at the lowest bid, and what arrived at Attica was whatever the supplier wanted to unload. The men eating it were the last ones in the chain who had any say, and their say was worth nothing. Number 16. Fatty salt pork. Pork at Attica was not a chop or a roast. It was a thick slab of heavily salted, mostly fat meat with a thin ribbon of actual flesh running through the center. The salt content was overwhelming enough to make your lips crack, and the fat had a slippery, waxy texture that coated the inside of your mouth and stayed there. It was cheap, calorie-dense, and simple to prepare in industrial quantities, which made it a kitchen favorite regardless of what the men thought about eating it. Salt pork appeared on the tray multiple times per month, whether anyone wanted it or not. The men who could not stomach the greasy texture simply went without, and nobody in the kitchen noticed or cared whether they ate or starved. Number 15. Liver. The kitchen served liver on a regular rotation, and the vast majority of inmates despised it. It arrived on the tray in thick, dark slabs, frequently undercooked at the center with a raw, bloody look and a metallic taste that made some men gag before the first bite. The texture was dense and grainy, crumbling in a way that felt wrong in the mouth. Nothing like the carefully prepared liver and onions that some of the older inmates remembered from their mothers' kitchens. There was no option to refuse and receive something else. Liver on the menu meant liver on your tray, and if you could not bring yourself to eat it, you sat there hungry until the next meal appeared hours later. There was no appeal, no comment card, no second option behind the counter. Number 14. Meatloaf from kitchen scraps. Nobody at Attica could tell you what was in the meatloaf, and that was the point. The kitchen collected every leftover scrap of meat from the week, ground it all together, mixed in enough breadcrumbs and filler to stretch the volume, packed it into pans, and baked it until the outside turned dark brown. The inside was gray, dense, and had a texture somewhere between wet clay and rubber. Some slices contained small pieces of gristle or bone that the grinder had failed to break down. The gravy ladled over the top was there to disguise the taste, but even the gravy could not cover the sour, metallic undertone that came from combining meats that had already been sitting for days. Men ate it because the alternative was nothing. Some traded their meatloaf slice for an extra piece of bread. Some swallowed it fast without chewing, trying to get it down before the flavor registered. The kitchen kept making it because it solved two problems at once. It used up scraps that would otherwise be thrown away, and it created something that technically qualified as a protein serving on the state's nutritional report. The men were not eating dinner. They were eating evidence of a bookkeeping exercise. Number 13. Lard on bread. Butter never made it inside Attica. What inmates got instead was a smear of rendered animal fat on their bread, a slick of lard that left a greasy film on the fingers, and a heavy, tallowy taste that lingered for hours. It was not seasoned. It was not softened. It was raw cooking fat spread across stale bread, and the state considered it a perfectly acceptable substitute for something most Americans took for granted at their own tables. You could smell it before you tasted it, and you could taste it long after the bread was gone. For the men inside, it was one more small indignity stacked on top of hundreds of others, served without apology, every single day. Number 12. Beef tongue. Every few weeks, the kitchen served tongue, not sliced thin and cured the way a good delicatessen would prepare it, but boiled whole, gray, and rubbery, dropped onto a metal tray with the papillae still visible on the surface. Most of the men on the outside had never seen a tongue served as food. Inside Attica, it was just another way the state stretched a dollar. Tongue was cheap. It was protein. And nobody in Albany cared whether the men eating it found it appetizing or revolting. The texture was dense and chewy in a way that no amount of boiling could fix, and the taste sat somewhere between bland and faintly metallic. Some men cut it into small pieces and swallowed without chewing. Others pushed it to the side of the tray and went hungry. Neither option felt like a meal. Number 11. Plain grits. In the breakfast rotation, grits appeared alongside the powdered eggs. But where grits on the outside would come with butter, cheese, salt, pepper, or a side of sausage, the Attica version came with absolutely nothing. Plain white grits cooked in water, scooped onto the tray in a pale mound that looked and tasted like wallpaper paste. The texture was gritty and watery when fresh, chalky, and stiff when it had been sitting. For Southern inmates who had grown up eating properly seasoned grits made with care, this was personal. It was not just bad food. It was a memory of home stripped of everything that made it worth remembering. A plate of grits back home meant family, meant mourning, meant somebody took the time. At Attica, it meant nothing at all. Number 10. Bruised and rotting fruit. When fruit appeared on the trays at Attica, it was never the kind you would pick up at a market. These were apples with soft brown craters covering half the surface, bananas so overripe the skin had turned black and split open, oranges with patches of white and green mold spreading across the peel. The facility purchased surplus produce that grocery stores and distributors had already rejected, bought at the lowest possible price because no one else wanted it. By the time it reached the men, it had often been sitting in storage for days beyond what was reasonable. Eating around the bad spots was the only option. Most men did exactly that, cutting away what they could with a plastic spoon and hoping the rest was still safe. Number 9. Unseasoned boiled potatoes. Potatoes showed up on the Attica tray more often than almost anything else. Boiled whole or in rough chunks, served completely plain with no salt, no butter, no gravy, no sour cream. Nothing. The skin was left on, often with dark spots and sprouted eyes still visible. The inside was mealy, dry, and crumbling, the kind of potato that falls apart when you press a fork into it but still manages to taste like absolutely nothing. It filled the stomach, and that was the beginning and end of its purpose. Nobody seasoned it. Nobody dressed it. Nobody apologized for it. The potato existed at Attica the way everything else did, stripped down to its cheapest possible form and handed over without a word. Number 8. Meals eaten in 10 minutes. The brutality was not always in the food itself. Sometimes it was in how little time you were given to eat it. Attica ran its mess hall on a rigid schedule designed to move large numbers of men through a small space as fast as possible. From the moment a man sat down with his tray to the moment a guard signaled the table to stand and move, roughly 10 minutes passed. That was breakfast, lunch, and dinner. 10 minutes to eat whatever the state had put in front of you, no matter how unappetizing, no matter how hot or cold, no matter how much you needed to force yourself to swallow it. Men who ate slowly went hungry. Men who hesitated over a suspicious piece of meat or a sour smell lost their window. There was no lingering, no second helpings, no conversation over a meal the way human beings have eaten together for thousands of years. You sat, you shoveled, you stood, you left. The schedule was not designed around nutrition or dignity. It was designed around control. And every man who lived through it understood that the clock was as much a part of the punishment as anything on the tray. Number 7. Cold canned hash. The kitchen opened industrial-sized cans of corned beef hash and scooped the contents directly onto trays without reheating. What arrived in front of each man was a dense, cold block of ground meat and potato bound together by congealed fat stamped into shape by the can itself. It tasted like salt and tin. The texture was gritty and paste-like, and it held the impression of a spoon the way clay holds a thumbprint. Heating it would have taken minutes. A sheet pan, an oven, a few moments of effort. But effort was not part of the equation at Attica. The hash came out of the can cold, it went onto the tray cold, and it reached the men cold. The state paid for the cheapest canned protein available, and the kitchen treated even that with contempt. Number 6. Insect-contaminated food, weevils in the flour, maggots in the bread, ants trailing through the sugar, roaches crossing the serving line in full view of the men waiting to eat. Insects were a recurring fact of life in the Attica kitchen, and the food they contaminated was still served without hesitation. Inmates described picking bugs out of their morning oatmeal, finding small larvae baked into the crust of bread rolls, and watching cockroaches scatter when trays were stacked at the end of a meal. The kitchen was not maintained to any standard that would have passed a health inspection on the outside. Storage areas were poorly sealed. Grain and flour sat in open containers. The result was food that regularly came with uninvited protein, and the people in charge treated it as a problem not worth solving. Number 5. Lukewarm canned stew. The stew at Attica came from industrial-sized cans, the kind bought by the pallet from the cheapest government supplier available. It arrived at the table barely warm, a thick brownish slurry with cubes of potato that had gone soft and translucent, chunks of fat posing as meat, and a layer of congealed grease floating on the surface that caught the fluorescent light. The flavor sat somewhere between salt and tin. Men who had worked in kitchens before their sentence said it tasted exactly like the can it came from, like metal and preservatives and nothing else. There was no seasoning, no onion, no pepper, nothing to suggest a human cook had been involved at any stage. The kitchen simply opened the cans, heated the contents to a temperature that technically met the minimum, and ladled it onto trays. Some nights the stew was not even heated all the way through, and the center of the serving was cold while the edges were warm. It was one of the most frequent meals on the rotation, appearing multiple times a week, and no amount of repetition ever made it easier to eat. Number 4. The budget tray. New York State allocated a shockingly small amount of money per inmate per day for food in the years leading up to the riot. The exact figure fluctuated, but it amounted to a fraction of what a free person on the outside would spend on a single meal at a diner. Every tray at Attica reflected that math: the cheapest available cuts of meat, the lowest grade canned produce, the most heavily processed substitutes for real ingredients that the procurement office could find. The men inside were not fed according to any meaningful nutritional standard. They were fed according to a budget line on a state spreadsheet, and that spreadsheet said they were worth as little as the law would allow. Number 3. Food served stone cold. Hot food at Attica was a rumor. The kitchen prepared meals hours before serving time, loaded them into warming trays that barely worked, and pushed them through a line so slow that the last men through received food that had gone completely cold. Mashed potatoes hardened into paste. Gravy congealed into a thick, cracked skin. Meat turned dry and gray. The men at the back of the line, often the same men every single day because the serving order almost never rotated, ate cold versions of meals that were already barely tolerable when warm. During upstate New York winters, when the cell blocks dropped near freezing, sitting down to a tray of cold, congealed food was not just unpleasant. It was demoralizing in a way that built up over months and years, meal after meal, tray after tray, until even the act of sitting down to eat felt like something being done to you rather than something done for you. Number 2. The final dinner. On the evening of September 8, 1971, the men at Attica sat down to eat what would be their last normal meal inside the facility as they knew it. Nobody at those tables realized it yet. The trays held the same tired, familiar food, the same cold portions, the same total absence of anything that suggested someone on the other side of the serving line cared whether the men eating it were properly fed or slowly starved. Some ate in silence. Others talked in low voices about what was building. By the next morning, the mess hall would stand empty. The yard would be full of men who had decided that enough was enough. And the food that had quietly ground these men down for years, meal after meal, tray after tray, would finally become one of the reasons the entire place came apart at the seams. Number 1. The breakfast they never received. On the morning of September 9, 1971, breakfast was prepared in the Attica kitchen the same way it always was. Powdered eggs sat in warming trays. Stale bread was stacked on the counter. Watered-down coffee steamed in the urns. Everything was ready. But the men never made it to the mess hall. That morning, the tensions that had been building for years over the food, over the conditions, over the daily indignities that no one on the outside ever had to witness, finally broke open. Inmates seized control of D-Yard, taking dozens of correctional officers and civilian workers as hostages. For the next 4 days, more than 1,000 men occupied the yard while state officials negotiated and the rest of the country watched. The breakfast that waited in the kitchen that morning was never touched. It sat there, cooling, congealing, turning into the same gray, lifeless mass it always became, only this time no one was coming to eat it. It was the same breakfast that had been served every day for years, the same food that tasted like indifference, the same trays that told more than 2,000 men, 3 times a day, that they were not worth feeding properly. The list of demands the inmates presented during the occupation included better food prepared under sanitary conditions, with religious dietary needs respected and portions adequate for working men. They were not asking for luxury. They were asking for meals a human being could eat without losing a piece of his dignity. 43 people died before the uprising was over. The breakfast that sat untouched in the kitchen on the morning it all began became a quiet symbol of everything Attica got wrong. Not because the food was the worst injustice inside those walls, but because it was the one injustice that happened 3 times a day, every single day, and nobody outside ever had to look at it. Those were 25 forgotten meals actually served at Attica before the 1971 riot. Every single one of them tells the same story. When you strip the dignity out of something as basic as a meal, you strip the dignity out of the person eating it. Which one of these hit you the hardest? Drop a comment and tell us. And if this is your first time here, hit subscribe. There is a lot more history like this on the way.